Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with our final panel discussion on sustainable ASEAN after this video from BLNG. Ladies and gentlemen, to now set the scene for our next panel discussion, we have Sir David Attenborough.
Good day to you, and I'm truly sorry that I can't be with you in person. There is one subject which is going to affect every single one of us, and that is, of course, climate change. I grew up in Britain. As a boy, I yearned to see the glories of the tropical world, the mysteries of the rainforest, the jungle, the unbelievable beauties of a coral reef, nature at its most complex and glorious. And nowhere are these beauties and wonders more evident than here in Southeast Asia. The Coral Triangle, the global centre of marine diversity, and the rainforest, which is the oldest in the world, dating back to 70 million years. And when I got here, I was not disappointed. I came here nearly 70 years ago, and these wonderlands were exactly like that. But since that time, they've changed. They have been dreadfully damaged, and I have seen it happening. Borneo has lost its rainforest at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world. 30% of it has gone within the last 40 years. Thailand and Vietnam, over a similar period, have lost half their mangroves, and in consequence their coasts and the cities built on them are losing their protection against tidal waves and storms. But the natural world is a source of more than just beauty. It provides us with every mouthful of food we eat and every lungful of air we breathe. Our health and our survival is dependent upon it, and yet we continue to destroy it. That is sheer folly. But these losses are not irreversible, not yet. Nature can recover if given the chance. Mangroves can be replanted. The rainforest can spread back into areas where it once flourished. Coral reefs will regrow if allowed to do so, and with a speed that will astonish anyone who's not familiar with the underwater world. And cities themselves, the home for so many of us, can welcome back wildlife and help it flourish, as Singapore, the city of nature, is now demonstrating so dramatically. Rainforests can still help to regulate world temperatures. Urban green spaces can help cool our cities and reduce the risk of floods. ASEAN has played a central role in this recovery. and must surely continue to do so with even greater determination and vigour. It's within your power to do even better. Humanity working together could, even now, stabilise the global rise in temperature to below 2 degrees, and so avert a major worldwide catastrophe. I'm truly delighted that the UK, as President of COP26 in partnership with Italy, is calling for urgent action to put the protection of nature and diversity at the very centre of climate policies. As we come out of COVID-19 pandemic, we must surely strengthen these efforts and build back and build greener. All of us, no matter who we are, have a responsibility to care for the planet. The future of all humanity now depends on us. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I wish you every success.
Sir David Attenborough, ladies and gentlemen. With that, we now hand over to our moderator for our final panel discussion. A warm welcome to Baroness Neville Rolfe, Chair, UK ASEAN Business Council.
Jenny, thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be at the summit once again, albeit not physically in Brunei as I had hoped. And as Chair of the UK ASEAN Business Council, I'm very excited to be part of the discussion on sustainable ASEAN. We have an excellent panel ahead of us to explore how Southeast Asia can be more sustainable and grow economically at the same time. As Prime Minister Boris Johnson mentioned when he spoke, we have to come together to find solutions, and we look forward to the outcomes at COP26, which starts in Glasgow in the UK later this week. To begin, I'm delighted to first introduce and welcome the new Secretary General of the OECD, who is joining us live from Paris. Secretary General Corman took up his post as the 6th Secretary General on the 1st of June this year. And he previously, of course, served as the Australian Minister for Finance, the leader of the government in the Australian Senate, and as federal senator representing the state of Western Australia. In these roles, he has been a strong advocate for the positive power of open markets, free trade, and the rules international trading system. Secretary General Corman, we are delighted that you are joining us from Paris to share with your thoughts on sustainability and economic recovery. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues. Thank you so much for inviting me to address you today at the Sustainable ASEAN session of the 2021 ASEAN Business and Investment Summit. And a particular thank you to the government of Brunei Darussalam for giving me this opportunity to discuss the ways the ASEAN region can optimize the strength and the quality of the recovery in the wake of the pandemic. Many countries around the world, including across Southeast Asia, continue, of course, to face serious challenges related to COVID-19. Recovery prospects for the region continue to gradually improve, while economic activity has not as yet returned to pre-pandemic levels. More countries are starting to reopen their borders, and of course, which will support a further recovery in activity, especially in the tourism sector, though levels of vaccination need to continue to increase across a significant part of the ASEAN region in order to really ensure we can benefit from a sustained recovery. Today's session takes place just a week ahead of COP26. Reaching global net zero is a global challenge. Like the virus, emissions don't stop at anyone's border. We need a lifting of ambition and effort around the world in a way that is effective and fair. Effective in that efforts in individual jurisdictions must help reduce global emissions rather than just shift emissions from one part to other parts of the world. And fair in that every country carries an appropriate proportionate and verifiable share of the burden. And this will require continuous commitment to effective multilateralism, finding the best possible globally coordinated approaches and solutions. And the world very much needs ASEAN to continue to be strongly engaged in that global conversation. At the OECD, we recently put forward a proposal to G20 member countries to help facilitate an ambitious but internationally more coherent, globally better coordinated approach to the pricing of carbon emissions. And as Indonesia takes on the G20 presidency, we very much look forward to engaging with Indonesia in relation to that particular proposal. The aim is to help ensure more ambitious, cost-effective action on climate change can be pursued in a way that doesn't cause trade distortions or carbon leakage. Indeed, how can we preserve a global level playing field while lifting our ambition and efforts on climate to the level required through an appropriately comprehensive, coherent global approach? And to achieve this, our proposal is to assess and report on explicit and implicit carbon pricing efforts around the world as a way to inform such a more coherent, globally better coordinated way forward. And recent increases in climate commitments from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and others are, of course, very welcome. I would like to say a few words now on key areas of action in national and regional efforts towards net zero. First, ASEAN's efforts to prioritize the transition to a circular economy are indeed impressive. OECD research shows that a significant proportion of greenhouse gas emissions come from materials production, particularly in a region such as yours. So your leadership in this field is key. Second, the energy sector is critical to our net zero efforts. Southeast Asia will be the center of global energy demand in the decades to come. You have a remarkable opportunity to address the triple goals of addressing energy poverty, national regional energy security, and indeed sustainable development by investing in renewables and energy efficiency, and by providing targeted support for poor energy consumers rather than pursuing the continued use of fossil fuel subsidies. When it comes to the transition to net zero carbon emissions, we will need both public and private efforts. Third, we need policies and regulatory frameworks which incentivize green investment and innovation. Because beyond governments, businesses can and must contribute by setting their own net zero targets, transforming their value chain emissions, focusing on climate-friendly investments, and supporting innovation. Greening supply chains will be a prerequisite for attracting quality foreign direct investment. Financial markets must be a part of the solution to climate change. It is important to advance efforts in the region to adopt sustainable finance practices, which will create a finance ecosystem that will provide adequate capital for the low carbon transition. We need to encourage and support local businesses. ASEAN countries are attractive destinations for investment. If you continue to put in place transparent and predictable regulatory frameworks, you should be able to attract a significant amount of the growing flow of international finance going towards sustainable investment in developing countries. The key message here is continue to design clear, integrated regulatory frameworks that offer stability and certainty for international investors. Our forthcoming economic outlook for Southeast Asia, China, and India assesses various market-based options such as social bonds and green bonds, highlighting the need to strengthen the region's market infrastructure and facilitating issuance by small firms. The OECD is also advancing a policy framework to integrate environmental, social, and governance factors that support a just net zero transition, including definitions, principles, and due diligence guidance for sustainable and climate-related finance. Southeast Asia also has a significant proportion of the world's biodiversity, both marine and forest-based. You have an opportunity to pursue economic development while conserving your natural systems through nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions is a means of ensuring economic development goals which align with environmental and community goals. It allows countries to monetize and value your natural resources. Southeast Asia is a region of islands. You're the stewards of a significant part of the world's salt waterways. You can become leaders in addressing marine litter. This is vital for your local communities and your fishing and tourism industries. The OECD is working with ASEAN to tackle the challenges of marine plastic pollution, which are threatening the region's ocean health and sustainable ocean economy. Our forthcoming Global Plastics Outlook estimates that the stock of plastic debris in oceans and rivers already amounts to more than 60 million tons and is rapidly growing. The OECD looks forward to deepening the collaboration with ASEAN to address this important global challenge. Many ASEAN countries already have started to put in place effective recycling system. The next step is to phase out single-use plastics and move toward a full system of reuse. This could also bring economic benefits. Southeast Asia is also a region of growing metropolises. The focus on sustainable infrastructure development will be key. Careful planning now would help deliver better connected public transport systems, for example. It will be important to plan for this now. This would allow you to not only address greenhouse gas emissions, but also another key challenge in parts of Southeast Asia, namely localized air pollution. Tackling climate change effectively and efficiently, as with all global challenges, requires, as I mentioned, strong globally coordinated action. That is why we are strengthening our global engagement and promoting OECD's values, principles, and standards all around the world, and in particular towards the Asia Pacific, a region of key strategic priority. Let us continue to work together, including through the OECD Southeast Asia Regional Programme, to define solid pathways to realize the sustainable ASEAN. I wish you an excellent discussion at your panel. Thank you for inviting me.
Secretary General, thank you so much for joining us and for delivering your address. As you said, ASEAN needs to be actively involved in the conversation that is being had, and the collaboration between the OECD, who I remember so well from my time as a minister, and ASEAN is particularly important. So we greatly appreciate your time today. Thank you for being with us. I'm now delighted to invite to the stage my excellent panel of experts to build on that important address. We're here today with a fine mix of geographies and of backgrounds. We have Andrew Morlett, CEO of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which focuses on the circular economy and is based in the United Kingdom. Surendra Rosha, Co-Chief Executive Asia Pacific of HSBC, who's based in Hong Kong. Farida Dato Talib, Managing Director and CEO of Brunei Liquefied Natural Gas. And I should note, the first female Managing Director of Brunei LNG. And finally, Associate Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Now, one of Brunei's deliverables as chair of ASEAN is on the circular economy. Andrew, you're the CEO of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which focuses on just that. Can you tell us a little bit, please, about this and how emerging economies, which make up, of course, most of Southeast Asia, can benefit?
Well, thank you for inviting me to join today. It's a pleasure and an honor. Regarding the circular economy, the best way to think about this is in comparison to the economic model we currently have, which we refer to as a linear economy. It's a linear system. In the linear economy, we really take resources out of the ground and we turn them into something. We use them for a very short period of time, and then they go to waste or landfill incineration. It's massively wasteful. It's extraordinarily energy intensive and polluting. And it's clear that this model cannot be the basis for ongoing future development. And as we heard from David Attenborough, the impact of the linear economy is profound. If we think about climate change, we need to focus on energy transition, but actually 45% of the solutions exist within the way in which we make and use things. And if we think about biodiversity loss, 90% of this loss comes from the resource extraction and processing we actually currently need to enable the linear economy to work. So it's not just about environmental considerations, though. The linear economy is fundamentally intertwined in the way in which future industry and sectors work. And we need to actually think about and rethink the way in which the economy works, and we need to transform this in the future so that we can actually keep the value of the materials, the resources, the products that we put on the economy in the economy and keep them out of the natural environment. And by doing this, we lower the impact of this circular economy on the environment and significantly lower the energy demand of it as well. But many people tend to think about the circular economy primarily as a waste management and recycling agenda. And that's part of it, but it's a much, much bigger idea, actually. It's really about how we make and use products and materials and food. And it actually is a systems framework that, if we apply the levers of a circular economy, can have a very significant impact on creation of new forms of economic value, massively reduce pollution, and massively reduce the energy demand. And it's really based on three principles. By design, we want to eliminate waste and pollution. We need to do that up front rather than just think of it as a waste and recycling problem, for example. And we need to circulate the products and materials and use them much longer. We need to design them for repairability, upgradability, longevity, reusability, resale, etc. And this is really crucial because there's an enormous amount of embedded energy and highly valuable materials in these products. So we need to keep them in use and circulation longer. And we actually, thirdly, need to think about how we regenerate natural systems by design. And this is particularly important for the way in which we think about food and the way in which we design food so that it uses more biodiverse materials and it relies much more on regenerative farming practices. And we're seeing this idea of the circular economy taken up around the world by leading businesses, by leading governments and cities. And it's an inspiring vision for a model that can work in the long run and create greater value. And of course, it's crucial in ASEAN. And as we see the upcoming G20 presidency being taken over by Indonesia next year, we're looking forward to seeing policy, businesses and finance come together in a way that are pulling in the same direction towards this vision of a circular economy. And while the policy considerations are really crucial, they need to be applied in a way that is tailored to the specific economies themselves. So this combination of tailored enabling policy and innovation in business to rethink and redesign the way in which we make and use things is really crucial. And we are very much looking forward to working with the key actors across ASEAN over the coming years to really accelerate this idea and to rethink the path forward and to create a new economic opportunity through the adoption of the bigger idea of a circular economy.
Andrew, thank you so much for that. And as you say, David Attenborough was an inspiration, and your comments have added to that. You made some excellent points, which I'm sure we'll come back to, including indeed emphasizing that Indonesia will have share the G20 in the coming year, and then ASEAN after that. But now I'd like to move on to Rosha, co-CEO of HSBC for Asia Pacific from Hong Kong. Rosha, how are organizations like yours approaching the sustainability challenge?
Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of the panel today on a topic that is one of the most critical subjects of our time. Paris was a watershed moment. The impact of meeting the Paris Agreement commitments for nations and organizations has been profound. But it created real momentum for financial companies to integrate sustainability into their commercial strategies. Firstly, by setting targets for financing, sustainable financing, and being accountable for those targets. Secondly, working with policymakers on the climate risks faced by businesses. And then thirdly, working on what transition means for them. Many financial institutions, including HSBC, saw the Paris targets as a starting point rather than an end goal in a long journey, using the opportunity to set our ambitions much higher. So in October last year, we said by 2050, we will become a net zero bank. It means we are doing this across the bank, in our own operations, in our supply chain, and by supporting our customers in their own transitions. But there are significant challenges that Asia will have to overcome if we are to succeed. After all, we live in a world that is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, especially in the ASEAN region. And from a wider perspective, 87% of incremental global emissions since 1990 have come from Asia. Huge investments will be needed, trillions and trillions of dollars, as we know from various studies, if we are to achieve net zero. And we need to do all of this while still delivering growth to developing markets. We at HSBC strongly believe that the private sector has a responsibility to protect communities where they operate from climate change. And if we do not address climate change in ASEAN by 2030, it hits the region by 11% in terms of GDP by the year 2100. But all of this is going to be expensive. The annual financing gap in 8 of the 11 Southeast Asian countries was estimated to be $102 billion from 2016 to 2020. And this may have worsened since COVID-19 hit. The bloc needs some 2.8 trillion in infrastructure investment alone between 2016 and 2030. So how do we bring all of this together? How do we achieve an economic transformation that dramatically cuts carbon emissions and yet still ensure that there is lasting economic growth? Firstly, the public and private sectors have to work together to support new investment opportunities. Governments have a strong role to play in sending clear and consistent signals to incentivize the change of behavior they require. And the private sector needs to recognize these signals and invest. If the public and private sectors can align, I believe we can deliver net zero transformation. The second priority is ensuring that the financial sector plays its role as a catalyst for change. I strongly believe that banks like ours have a responsibility to help governments and companies to chart their own transition and prepare fully for a net zero future. We said we will prioritize financing and investment to support our customers by lending between 750 billion and 1 trillion to fund net zero transitions over the next 10 years. We also said we will help unlock the potential of nature and technology to help solve some of the issues that face us. This led us to join with World Resources Institute and WWF to form a 5-year, $100 million philanthropic climate solutions partnership, which is aimed at scaling up climate innovation ventures, supporting nature-based solutions, and helping to move the energy sector towards renewables in Asia. But supporting our clients in their transition is probably the most important contribution we can make. It is about understanding how their businesses will change as the economy decarbonizes, and making sure they understand how our own risk appetite will change as financial institutions, and then discussing how we can help the investments be financed that they need to make. I'll give you 3 examples of where we hope to make a transformative impact. Firstly, in sustainable infrastructure. We have linked up with IFC, the OECD, and others to create Fast Infra, finance to accelerate the sustainable transition in infrastructure, which aims to raise private investments to fund sustainable infrastructure in developing markets. The initiative will establish ESG performance standards. Meeting these will represent a stamp of quality, a kite mark, so to speak, so that any government or developer can ensure their infra assets consistently conform to the highest standards, and investors can be confident that their investments are sustainable. So far, over 50 global entities representing governments at all levels, the financial sector, investors, rating agencies, and NGOs are now participating in this initiative. Secondly, I'd like to highlight supply chain. They were mentioned earlier as well. As the largest trade finance bank in the world, we see the international, and we have an international network that covers about 90% of global GDP. And we see trade flows of about 760 billion last year in 2020. We are in a unique position to mobilize change. For large consumer companies, typically 80% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the smaller companies that make up their supply chains. Walmart is a great example where we are helping. For Walmart's supply chain finance program, we are incentivizing sustainability with improved finance terms for suppliers who make environmentally positive changes. Walmart's initiative aims to cut 1 billion metric tons or a gigaton of greenhouse gases from their global supply chain by 2030. And the last initiative is blended finance and reaching parts of the economy that would not be commercially viable for the private sector alone. We recently announced a partnership with Temasek in which we will co-invest in a fund that will initially focus on renewable energy, water, waste, and green transport sectors. We hope to use seed capital of 150 million to mobilize over $1 billion in blended finance over the next 5 years. The intent of the platform is ultimately to aim to bridge the green bankability gap, financing sustainable projects which don't quite satisfy the risk or return requirements of ordinary commercial loans. The fund aims to de-risk green infrastructure lending and open the door for institutional investors and sovereign wealth funds to invest with greater peace of mind. We're very much looking forward to working with our customers and other stakeholders, including the government, to bring this to life in the near future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Roger, excellent points and some wonderful examples for us to draw on in our panel. Thank you. I'd now like to move on. Farida, from Brunei Liquefied Natural Gas. You boast the oldest LNG plant in the world. Can you talk to us about how you are approaching the changing nature of energy?
Thank you, Baroness. I'm deeply honored to be part of this dialogue on sustainability and its importance for the future and the role we play, a subject I'm passionate about. Sustainability is actually at the core of the BLNG business in many aspects. We are a key contributor to Brunei Darussalam's GDP, enabling the development and growth of the nation. We are also an engine of growth for the country, and our continuous revenue generation is essential in powering the progress of sustainability efforts in Brunei and in building future capability. Beyond this, we are also a proud provider of sustainable and clean energy to the region. In today's panel, I will be exploring three main. One is around gas as a bridge to decarbonization, partnering with renewable forms of energy. The other is around carbon pricing incentives or nature-based solutions to incentivize businesses to drive their emissions down. And last but not least, of course, where can we find synergies across and between industries where emissions cannot be avoided? In an essence, a circular economy between industries, as it were. So with 50% lower emission than coal, LNG and gas plays a prominent role in complementing renewables and acting as a bridge towards the journey to decarbonization, especially in emerging economies like ASEAN. As the region is transitioning into lower carbon, ASEAN's economic growth is likely to make it the world's fourth largest economy by 2030, competing with the likes of the EU and US. So unlocking the demand for gas in the smaller and emerging economies in ASEAN is fundamental to ensure energy security in this region, where the total final energy consumption is forecasted to grow by 146% in 2040. Scalable solutions like small-scale opportunities or plays within LNG and other forms of energy can play a key role in ASEAN's energy transition agenda as an alternative fuel to diesel, which is currently often the fuel of choice for remote locations, which have no access to pipeline gas, for instance. So LNG producing companies like ourselves can play a role in the ASEAN energy transition by providing an important building block of the required supply chain. I'm pleased that there is already a focus from ASEAN to promote gas and LNG infrastructure within this region as part of the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, the Trans-ASEAN Gas Pipeline Program. So the viability of the path to net zero is dependent on industrial collaboration, as been mentioned by my two esteemed colleagues who spoke before me. And really, it does require the creation of a symbiotic relationship between industries to enable a holistic approach towards CO2 abatement. So for instance, an opportunity that could be feasible today would be to partner with, for myself as an LNG operations, would be to partner with other downstream industries to do a carbon capture utilization, which is then to recycle the carbon dioxide that has been emitted for further usage downstream, so that it prevents it being emitted out into the atmosphere. This, of course, is largely dependent on availability of consumers in proximity to our assets, the scale of economy, and of course, carbon incentives. Our strategy should be to avoid and reduce emissions as much as possible, and to protect and compensate the environment for emissions that cannot be further avoided and reduced. So as a 52-year-old plant, we have taken steps to improve our own energy efficiency through collaboration with the government of His Majesty Sultan via the Department of Electrical Service, where we maximize the waste heat generated from the power generation plant next to our site for our own steam generation. This is in a bid to actually reduce our own greenhouse gas intensity. We're also looking to shift 10% of our own power generation source from fuel gas to renewable energy by 2025 as part of our initiative to become more sustainable. Now, earlier this year, we were elated to be the first carbon-neutral LNG cargo supplier in the Southeast Asian region. This was an integrated, collaborative effort between players in the whole value chain, and it made an important milestone in our journey as a key partner for energy transition, whilst enabling our own customers to move towards their net zero ambition by compensating for the full life cycle of the CO2 equivalent emissions of the cargo with nature-based solutions. So to me, decarbonization, especially in a developing and growing region, is a complex journey that requires industrial collaboration between and across industries in a more sustained and integrated way, leveraging on public and private partnership. The journey of sustainability is multifaceted with different pathways to take. It requires collaboration, clear ambition, long-term planning for it to materialize. And it can only work with incentives and requires regional collaboration with regards to carbon tax policies and the promotion of cross-border carbon mechanisms. So I look forward for the dialogue with my fellow panelists today on their thoughts and views on sustainability and net zero. Thank you.
Farida, thank you so much. And it's great to hear you as an example of Brunei being so proactive on these global issues. And we now turn to Professor Simon Tay. Simon, you chair the oldest think tank in Singapore, and we've heard about sustainability from a global perspective, from the finance and energy perspective, and about incentives. Could you please bring the ASEAN view with your opening remarks? How can ASEAN grow sustainably?
Thank you very much, Baroness. I'd like to join many of the comments made earlier about the private sector, the energy transition, as well as the importance of green finance and supply chains. I shall try not to repeat them, because while this is a vital part of the picture, and of course to our audience, business and investment, I think the other part of the picture can't be taken for granted. And this is the role of governments and also the dangers and risks. The SWA, which I chair, grew into this area of sustainability because of that risk. We seized upon the issue of the transboundary haze pollution, which is a local pollution for Indonesia, a regional harm, as well as a huge global scale emission of carbon gas. I think that really from there, we've had to look at the agroforestry issues and the companies in the area, and then finally looking at supply chains and the green finance issues. And in the process, we've broadened our work to the infrastructure, and forthcoming, we'll be looking very much at us and creating a truly collective community approach to the climate change problem. Now, our panelists have spoken about how ASEAN is much an integrated economy. That's true, and we ambition of the ASEAN Economic Community that the SWI also studies and supports. But additionally, we're only at the start of really seeing it as an ecological and climate community. Now, what is the difference? We are working, to be fair, and the ASEAN Secretary General spoke earlier in the day. We are looking at various issues such as the haze, about mangrove restoration, wildlife trafficking, renewable energy, and we're starting to have a taxonomy on sustainable finance. But while ASEAN is conscious of the climate crisis, they really haven't come together. The nationally determined contributions, NDCs, announced at Glasgow, will be each country by itself. It's wonderful to hear that ASEAN will now have a joint statement about climate change to start to recognize and deal with this issue. Now, what needs to be done is not just, of course, a statement at the COP, really to have a common or harmonized approach, despite or because, in fact, of the diversity of our countries and our economies. In this sense, we have to start to see that sustainability and climate are not environmental issues per se, but deeply economic. Implications for investment and trade and production are all there. And the markets are going to have to be the ones to move the change, but governments can and need to create and shape those markets. One will be carbon pricing. This was mentioned by several speakers, including my old friend Mari Pangestu earlier in the day. Carbon pricing will be integral to ASEAN's economic ambitions to be a leading economy, an integrated economy, and also to decarbonize and deal with climate. It must be competitive in global trade terms, and the coming picture of trade will include having to deal with the risk of carbon leakage. Governments at the present are avoiding this. And yet, our trade partners, the EU, carbon border adjustment measure is coming, has been announced and will come into relations with ASEAN before too long. Carbon neutrality commitments have been made by some of our largest investors in our region, like China, Japan, and Korea. At the moment, my country, Singapore, is the only ASEAN country to implement a carbon price at the present. Now, obviously, this is at the moment quite low, but that's how Singapore works. We introduce it at a low level, and we'll start to go up as we deal with the problem sequentially and rationally figure out how to really get that maximum effect without making our economy uncompetitive. I'm delighted to hear that Brunei and Malaysia have also announced plans to use carbon pricing. Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam will work on emissions trading, and the Philippines is considering.
So we've looked you. We should. Are you back? Right. I think we'll have to move on and ask the professor to finish your Q&A. Perhaps I could start by saying we're very keen to hear from the audience on this occasion. So can I please ask you to put your questions in the chat box, and we will try and cover as many as possible during this short session. But if I may, I'd like to go back to Rosha, please. ASEAN's approach to a low-carbon economy is clearly gathering pace from everything we've heard. How important is it for the region to establish its own approach to transition, which I think was one of the things that Professor Tay was suggesting?
Sure, thank you. So, first of all, let me say, if you were in any doubt as to the gravity of the situation in the IPCC report that was published this August, made the gravity of the situation very clear. It set out the evidence that the changes to the climate are the result of human activity. And the world's remaining carbon budget, consistent with a 1.5 degree rise, is around 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide. At current emissions, we'll exhaust this in 10 years' time. Asia and ASEAN especially is particularly vulnerable. Now, transition is a process of build-up of innovation and breakdown of existing structures. This requires time, investment, and expertise. And we recognize the responsibility is on us to lead this transformation. The finance industry can direct transition in the corporate sector by investing in and lending to companies that contribute positively to decarbonization. Through an industry outreach program, we have been advising ASEAN policymakers on how best to structure the regional transition to ensure an unobstructed flow of international finance. Of course, we are also open to engaging with governments bilaterally, but I think as a unit, ASEAN can prepare better for the future. And ASEAN's voice needs to be heard because announcing a transition pathway for the region now is important and urgent, as Professor Tay also alluded to earlier. Otherwise, there is a risk that the rules of the road that will govern the flow of investments that will be set in other regions and perhaps in the interest of advanced economies. Countries and industries are increasingly making net zero commitments, and the pressure for ASEAN to do the same might become irresistible. But that does not mean that the transition in ASEAN needs to be identical to other regions. It must and should be varied to suit the needs of these markets and needs to be just. While most developed economies have reached peak carbon emissions, many parts of Asia carbon output is still growing. So we need to balance continued growth, rising living standards with decarbonization. And therefore, it is critical that the transition plan is credible. It should give some indication of a net zero destination that is Paris aligned. And it must include interim short-term targets, particularly for key sectors, so that it can allow economic actors to contribute. This would give companies, investors doing business with them, the certainty they require to commit the dollars and the billions of dollars that would, or trillions of dollars that would be required for climate transition. So I think that would be my thought on how ASEAN can approach it.
And briefly, that means a role for ASEAN in this process?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Farida, from an energy perspective, how realistic and feasible is it for ASEAN to transition, given, as Russia has said, the different stages of development that different parts of the world are at? And what is the role of hydrogen, which you've obviously championed?
No, thank you for that. So I think in some ways it is, if you look at ASEAN as a growing economy, which is almost going to be the fourth biggest economy worldwide, and with over 700 million people by 2030 within ASEAN, clearly there's a need for uninterrupted access to energy, and energy use equates to economic activity. So we know that a large portion of that energy consumption will be in four main areas: power, transport, industry, as well as buildings. Now, 55% of the total global greenhouse emissions comes from electricity and transportation. And this is where I think ASEAN can spend a bit more of their focused efforts, as it tries to then, continue to still have the economy driven by the higher energy intensity kind of businesses, which is a part of its of economic drivers, like the oil and gas industries. So, for instance, we know that coal is also a big part of the energy of the power fuel that's being used for power electricity generation. And the best way to bring emissions in power is, of course, to shift to renewable forms of fuel sources. Now, currently, we know there's only about 20% of renewables energy is being deployed, so that it will take time to shift that. And we know that there's also always going to be a need for higher energy that can only be provided by hydrocarbon kind of sources, where it provides intense heat and intense power. So, just by switching away from coal to natural gas will help make that shift. Will help to move to bring down the emission levels. and will complement the decarbonization journey with renewables. So we've seen that already in last year, and then the pandemic was a big driver for sustainability. We saw that 3 out of the top 10 carbon dioxide emitters, China, Japan, and Korea, all made their net zero commitments. Japan and Korea by 2050 and China by 2060. And they made that commitments by having higher renewables capacity, as well as shifting and shutting down coal capacity. So those are the kind of steps that the government will have to take in order to be able to shift to deliver, to meet their net zero commitments. And it will be, I think it will be an economic as well as a decision as well, because as was mentioned earlier, we are trying to deal with not only energy security, but also address energy poverty. So how do we make that in a way that's balanced and allows all the various countries within ASEAN to still grow and still have access to energy in a sustainable way?
Fareed, thank you. I think you're fading a bit.
Am I?
So perhaps I can bring in Simon, who has now rejoined us. Apologies for the problems.
Probably
Simon,
my side, and it's a very quick way of cutting me off. I was probably talking too long.
It was certainly entirely unintentional, but funnily enough, we were picking up on what you were saying about the need for a sort of regional approach and for governments to act. I mean, what do you think about ASEAN actually developing its own sustainability rules? And what are the policy considerations, do you think, for ASEAN's business community in such an approach? Many of them who are SMEs, who we heard from HSBC and indeed from Farida, that the bigger companies are trying to help.
I think, if I may, I think many of us who deal with ASEAN, including businesses, understand that we are both a group, ASEAN, with its own particularities, but we are very open and global. That applies to every area. You look at trade, investment. We need to be open to the investors from all over the world, and therefore to offer them very much the same sets of rules. And so it is with climate as an economic issue, or sustainability as economic issues. So there'll be some adjustment. This taxonomy of green finance in ASEAN will have to be adjusted to some of the particular needs, especially given the differences in our financial sector. But we shouldn't depart too much from the global rules. In fact, quite the reverse. Like a useful developing country group, we should bring some of those concerns with us to Glasgow, which is the opposite point I'm trying to make, that really coming together, coming community is not just internal, but to give ASEAN more of a global voice. China clearly has one. We're not China, but at 650 million plus, we need and should speak up. Hopefully, as some have said, in tandem with Indonesia, our biggest member, next year when it chairs the G20. There's everything to play for and much need for ASEAN to get our own act together to approach the global stage.
Andrew, you might like to come in on this, and perhaps you could also talk a little bit about the nature-based solutions, such as restoring natural forests and putting green spaces into cities as part of that.
Yes, I think the conversation's interesting because it really points to the multifaceted challenge that this transformation is going to require. On the one hand, it's the energy agenda, but on the other hand, actually, we need a huge investment in innovation for new solutions that are circular economic in nature. Based on the principles that I talked about earlier, the elimination of pollution, the keeping of materials in use, and the regeneration of natural systems. Now, if you focus on those principles, the application, the policy can vary by country, which has a different setup. But we need to be orienting towards a vision and be designing policy and stimulating innovation within private industry towards those principles. Food's a very good example, and food, I think, is going to be one of the big challenges going forward, but it is also a huge opportunity as it relates to climate change and to biodiversity. And we need to think about food in terms of a design challenge, and this hasn't really been the case to date. You know, how we think about the ingredients and ensuring that we're encouraging a more diverse set of ingredients into food is super important, because today we're focusing in commodities on a very, very small number of commodities that are causing monocrop agricultural practices that are destroying biodiversity and habitat. So we need to, think about the design of the upstream design of food in a way that sources and creates markets for more diverse agricultural products. And at the same time, we have policies and procurement practices in industry by food producers that are biasing towards regenerative agricultural practices. So we're starting to see a much more upstream focus on regenerating natural systems, and I think that's really super important. I think getting this combination of industrial innovation oriented the right way and policy to enable that to happen. And the third thing I think that's super important in ASEAN is the infrastructure point that Roshan commented on before. There's some massive infrastructure investment requirements. If you think of plastics pollution as an example, the amount of waste infrastructure investment that is going to be needed over the coming years is really huge. And we need to get focused on that on the one hand, and on the other hand, we need to look at the innovation of the products and the what's going into the system, the products, service systems approaches. So the two things intersect, and we get a better outcome faster.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in one of the audience, if I may. It's from Suzanne Neve. Will HSBC Climate Solutions Partnership support projects relating to transformation of agriculture sector, or is it only targeting the energy sector? So, Rosha, that follows on actually from what Andrew's been saying about this important area. Would you like to comment? And we'd also be very interested in your views about, whether ASEAN should have its own sustainability rules.
So firstly, on the question itself, yes, absolutely. I mean, it really, we will be largely led by two pieces. One is our own clients and their interests. So where agriculture would come in that context could be supply chains of some of our large customers who are in, for example, the garment space, etc. How would they look at making sure that their supply chains are sustainable and how we could support that. And the second is in our partnership with WWF and the World Resources Institute, which I had mentioned earlier, where absolutely, again, nature-based solutions which involve transforming agriculture to be more sustainable would be certainly workable. It could also relate to things like mangroves and other such areas where we could look to support and make things commercially viable. But we would work with those partners because we don't see ourselves as being experts in those specific areas and how that could possibly play out. Sorry, Baroness, on your second question, if I may request you to repeat that again.
It's the question of, should ASEAN or the region be looking towards any respect to taxonomy, sustainability rules?
I do think that alignment across the ASEAN is really important to build scale and build scale in the discussions that will happen globally. So as many of the panelists have said, with Indonesia taking on the presidency of the G20, that would be a point in time where ASEAN presenting itself as through Indonesia as for a series of discussions to influence and advocate for certain types of changes to the global rule system, or to advocate for the rules that they feel are the best to position and push ahead is really important. But to form or to get there, you need to have a collective view, in my opinion, that would allow for that discussion to happen. And it's a bit like what we've seen out of Europe, where many nations have come together to really build consensus around how they want to approach this topic.
Okay. Well, Professor Tay, perhaps you'd like to come in on this.
Yes, I'd like to just jump in a bit on the agricultural point and the innovation point. Singapore, my small country, is really, in traditional terms of climate gases, very low in the world scale. But the levers we have of finance, technology, innovation can multiply the effect, the positive effect, I should say, we can have. Temasek, for example, is invested in these vegetable-based meat substitutes. I don't advertise for them, but I won't give the name. But this is very important in the sense of trying to create that protein in a sustainable way. Similarly, Singapore as a whole is a huge hub for finance and trade. So as we green the supply chains, as the traders start to shift their demands, this will have a ripple effect across the whole region. And we can't bring the region together ourselves. We need all 9 other members to collaborate. But it gives a certain optimism that ASEAN can start to have a serious dialogue to harmonize our approaches. And even if not differing so much from the global, and there's no need to, we will have our more coherent approach in the years to come. I think this year particularly could be a watershed year, given the sort of idea of transformation coming out of the pandemic, to twin the need for transformation or reform together with the need to become more efficient, more circular, much more carbon neutral in the way we approach things.
And how do you think ASEAN can encourage this greater adoption of green incentives, perhaps prioritizing of ESG factors? I mean, Temasek, I think somebody mentioned, was an example of somebody who's already doing a lot in this space.
Yes,
can you talk a little bit more about that?
When we did a survey of the green finance situation in Singapore and the region 4 years ago, we found there was so little attention to ESG. The growth has been phenomenal. I mean, we're not where we need to be. The transparency of companies, the reliability of those numbers, each bank, including the local banks, have to be quite wary about it. But I think the change has been for the positive and at quite a pace. The investors, I'm so happy to hear some Singapore investors talked about, but I'm equally convinced that a newer generation of CEOs and investors in our region, Indonesia, have a lot of the same ideas of how to grow the economy, grow their business, but in very green ways, and attract by being more transparent about the ESG, the right kinds of investors for the long term. So I think that this harmonization of the economic sort of positivities of ASEAN, together with the investment community, will be sort of hand-in-glove change. If I could add one point about energy transition, which I think is an example of this, the infrastructure energy transition. We will need bridging from brown to get to more khaki and then to green. So I think a lot of the thing has been said about gas being a potential bridge. But I think the further step, of course, is to put more renewables in that grid. And Singapore and other financial hubs and investors are well poised to do this and to link those grids up increasingly, not across the whole ASEAN at one go, but at least patchwork. And so Singapore this week has announced various trial imports of energy from our neighbors using the existing grid lines. In this sense, as they add more green sources, whether it's hydro or solar, will be some of the off-takers to that more green forms of energy.
Thank you for that. I mean, I've got another question. Transitioning towards renewables, how can we ASEAN countries ensure we have a sustainable supply of metals needed to build the infrastructure? Andrew, would you like to pick up on that?
Yes, I think it's really interesting right now, post-pandemic, the impact of the pandemic on commodity prices and the shortfalls we're seeing in production, etc. It is refocusing people on this commodities question. And the metals piece in particular, again, in a world where we have normalized disposability, and we are designing for disposability, on the other side of that, there's a huge, huge opportunity. If we think about how we design for disassembly and for component reuse and for remanufacturing and upgrading, etc., not only do you reduce the demand for raw materials, but you keep the invested energy in the materials and the products you've already made. And I think this is a huge wake-up call for people, actually, the notion of what we're investing in creating products, whether it's a smartphone or a steel girder, the amount of energy that goes into creating that. We want to actually maximize the return on invested energy as an agenda. And I think that this is starting to become clearer and clearer, that it's not just an energy transition we need, it's a transition in the way in which we make and use things, including food. And I just wanted to make one other comment as well in terms of the distinction between sustainability and what we're talking about in the circular economy and the regenerative economic space. I think we need to be clear that we have to reduce the harm of the linear economy, particularly through the transition, as Professor Tay said, as we go from, we go into khaki and green, we need to lightweight, and we need to reduce impact, and we need to, reduce the harm of a linear economy. But actually what we have to get to, and we have to get to it really quickly, is this question of how are we having a positive impact on the natural environment? How are we regenerating nature? And if, again, reflect on David Attenborough's images and the discussion that he was laying out, it's not just about reducing harm, it's totally rethinking how we make and use things so we restore and regenerate natural systems. And regenerative, it's a bigger idea as well. It's not just nature, but it's communities, and it's a more distributed, diverse and inclusive economy that we need to drive to. And I think this is where the debate needs to really shift to as quickly as possible.
I'm going to move on, if I may, because we've had a couple of questions on the challenging question of greenwashing. I'm going to come to you in a minute, Farida. So how can we ensure, as an ASEAN community, that we hold institutions to their promises and responsibilities and prevent greenwashing? And then, Professor Simon, greenwashing remain a major problem. Will there be a regional inspection agency for ASEAN to ensure investors that what we are investing in is green when we say it is green? Farida, would you like to start? And then I'll bring in the professor and then Russia.
Yeah, before I answer that, if I may just make a comment on the nature-based solutions, because it will tie into the answer. So the nature-based solutions that we talk to around the projects which protect or restore the land, sort of more focused version of what David Andrew just talked to earlier. So it becomes a natural CO2 sink. Now we've seen the expansion of this application of these voluntary carbon credits, right, to make businesses carbon neutral, ranging from airlines and car rental companies to technology companies such as Google. And the more recent trend of us as LNG companies using voluntary carbon credits to deliver carbon neutral LNG to cargoes to end users. So there's a huge potential in Southeast Asia to generate large volumes of carbon credits from the regional reforestation projects and the mangrove systems. So the Mantaya project in Borneo and Kalimantan is just an example of that, which is the largest emission reduction forest project. So to the point around, how do we prevent businesses from greenwashing? It has to have a kind of regulatory body to ensure that the credits that we are offsetting with have got a viable basis. So, for instance, a nature-based solution would be one example of that. And we, an example for us, when we ventured into carbon neutral offering, we actually went through the UKDC government standards and principles in order to ensure that we are not seen as greenwashing. So you do need regulatory bodies in place which define specific standards that people have to adhere to. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is the link to digitalization. It is ensuring that information and data, as they're monitoring and as they're creating these offsets for the scope 1, scope 2, or for the full end-to-end, has to be captured in a way that's consistent and also auditable. So that again requires a kind of body in place, either within ASEAN or within the Asia Pacific, that plays that independent role, and that all businesses have to actually be compliant to over the period of time, as we shift, as the professor says, from a brown to a green kind of world.
Simon, what do you think about that?
Yes, Baroness, thank you. I first want to be a bit provocative. I think that given the SME issue and the transition issue, ASEAN should not be too insistent on, you have to be really, really bright emerald green before we call you green. We might have to run the risk of some greenwashing controversies. Rather than trying to prevent them, we should call them out. We need to get more companies to declare in the first place whether they're on board or not, and then we need to verify them. And we need to, if they are on transition, we need to see their path of progress. We don't have to insist on the highest standards immediately, but we'll need to check them over time. And the banks are very well placed to do this. Now, some banks, of course, cut you off, but most banks in the region are taking much more a sort of counseling approach, understanding the business, seeing progress in a positive way, sometimes issuing warnings or, you can't do this, otherwise we'll have to look at this again. But really, oftentimes, coaching, pulling them along, nudging them. And I think industry bodies will need to do this too. We need to look at peers. Unless, again, we're prepared to cut off entire sectors, we'll need to look at best of class rather than in sort of absolute terms. One sector, the SWI work on, which is very important for the region, is agroforestry. We've seen a lot of progress. Some of the larger companies have taken on large carbon and conservation commitments. Some are able to track the supply chain, traceability has become much more important, verified, not just claimed. Some of them, however, are still not being financed by the big companies because deforestation is just a big sort of overhang issue, and there's sort of vague rumblings about the whole sector. They kind of some are being treated like a bit like a tobacco company is. And I think this is where we need to bring together the industry standards, the understanding of what is doable at different points in time of the journey, and we need to, of course, bring in technology and other verification. And technology will be very important. One Singapore company, Olam, is a large buyer of a lot of agricultural goods. It's able to trace and deal with small farmers in Africa and other parts of the world very directly. And I think a further step will be to eventually use blockchain to really sort of demarcate all the elements of the supply chain so it's completely verified and can't be fixed on anybody's ledger.
Rosha, briefly, and then we're going to move on to questions.
Yeah,
I would just say thank you very much.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Please.
I'll just say that all very valid points made, but let me just say that from a regulated industry standpoint, as banks are, the regulators will very quickly be setting the standards, in my view, on any action that acts as greenwashing within the sector. I think that is a change that is coming, given the need for quick movement and assessment of risk in the sector. What is the physical risk to institutions in terms of their lending books? What does that pose? What does climate risk pose as risk to our books? Given that this can accelerate pretty quickly if we don't act now. So these are things that regulators are looking at, and I think that the need for data and ability to measure what is the emissions per dollar that I lend into one industry versus another. I think all of this is something that collectively the industry will have to work on, and in that process, make sure that there's uniformity to avoid that greenwashing, if I may. One point I will make, though, is the point that Professor Tay made, which is you can't do this by exclusion, because you need this transition to be just, right? So you can't shut out parts of the population because there is a need for a calibrated change.
I'm so glad you made the point about exclusion, because it was the point I was going to make. That some companies have, in gas and oil and so on, come from a certain background, and they are making efforts to change and to initiate a transition. And as you say, we need to make sure we don't exclude them, but we actually praise them where they make progress. The last question I wanted to ask each member of the panel before we close was, obviously we've got the ASEAN Leaders Summit beginning tomorrow. Could I invite you, to conclude and also to make perhaps one recommendation on sustainability to send forward to that summit? Andrew, would you like to start?
Well, I think the discussion we've had on this panel actually informs that. And I think the one thing that I would say would be that if ASEAN as a collection of countries can align to a common vision and a set of principles that it moves towards, that capture the essence of the circular economy and the energy transition and the need for a just transition, and put in place a mechanism for the measurement of progress and reward the front runners and invest in innovation. I managed to pack a few in there, but I think that's the general direction.
Thank you. Rosha?
Yeah, I would just say that, on similar lines, I think the drive for decarbonization is imminent, and it's absolutely necessary for ASEAN to have a seat at the table given the population that they represent. Otherwise rules will be designed elsewhere and will not reflect the needs of the region. So if I had one ask to the leaders, it would be to come together to start to define what their set of rules or how they would like to shape the rules.
Farida?
All right, so to my mind, I think the solution space will have to be an and when it comes to net zero. It requires an array of solutions to make the journey realistic. It requires including the consideration of nature-based solutions for things that are emissions that are difficult to abate. It requires cohesive community effort to move the energy mix away from high carbon intensity beyond just developing infrastructures. It requires regional collaboration with regards to carbon tax policies and promotion of carbon border mechanisms to drive the shift, and also to promote maybe a greater pool of green bonds to support socially responsible investment in, say, carbon capture and make that more commercial.
And with your knowledge of Brunei and of ASEAN, are there particular nature-based solutions that we should be highlighting for the leaders?
For Brunei, we've been, if we look at the rate of deforestation that we see in Southeast Asia to date since 2005, because of forestation, farming, agriculture, because of fire, which has affected the hydrological cycles, created soil erosion. We've been looking at planting trees. But I remember David Attenborough's piece around one of the videos where he was saying that, not all green is equal. So what do we need to do to be able to understand the ecosystem of our forests in order to ensure that we've got the right vegetative cover and the right impact to raising the hydrological cycle, as well as minimizing soil erosion and preserving our biodiversity. So that would be, and to that point, I would like to say that Brunei still maintains 17% of the forest cover in ASEAN, and for us that would be a very key driver.
Well, thank you for that. And Simon.
Thank you, Baroness. The ASEAN Summit is something that the SWI and I cover with our other lens of political economy. And I tell you, the agenda is hugely crowded. Of course, number one is that effort to recover from the pandemic, start to open up the domestic economy, get some growth, get some jobs for people. Then the second, of course, will be the particular issue of Myanmar, and then the problems there, and broadly set within the Sino-American tensions and the shifting supply chains of this world. Within that, I think carbon and sustainability will always need to be the and factor. We mustn't see it as a separate pocket of issues. We need to align it. So, for example, we look at the future of the digital economy. we need to start asking ourselves the question of sustainability and the digital economy. And we talk about the politics, we'll need to talk about ASEAN going beyond this common statement. I mean, 2 years ago, we had 2 sentences in the then chairman's statement of the climate change. We need to really start on many of the changes to bring ASEAN markets, ASEAN companies, ASEAN governments together in the way this panel has discussed. We need to see the end issue in terms of the finance and the recovery from the pandemic, the growing of more resilient supply chains, also the creation of greater infrastructure that can link the region, integrate them in a comprehensive recovery from the pandemic. The European Union, in a way, has led the way, talking about a green recovery and putting a huge number for it. ASEAN can't follow that path in terms of the huge number, but it can have the concept and the will to work together for each benefit. I was delighted to hear David Attenborough talk about Singapore, my small country, as a city that has both the built-up hub of that city, but also a recovering nature. I think we're doing it not for the world, we're not doing it for ASEAN, we're kind of doing it because we enjoy it, we benefit from it. And I think, in the sense, each country was asked what they benefit, how do we contribute, what are our rights and what are our responsibilities for the climate and sustainability issues.
Well, thank you for that. And I think we have come to the conclusion that ASEAN needs a global voice, that we have a huge challenge, as we heard from David Attenborough. We've got some big opportunities. So there's our Leaders Summit for ASEAN, this COP26, which is bringing the whole world together, including many delegates from ASEAN. And this is the moment for the public and the private sector, who are both represented on today's panel, I think, to come together and work constructively. The whole sort of basket of solutions, from nature-based solutions to bonds, to finance, to innovation itself, and to assisting the energy transition that we've heard so much about today. So if I might, I'd like to thank you all for being such a creative and lively panel. That's Andrew Morlett of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Surendra Rosha, Co-Chief Executive Asia Pacific HSBC, Farida Dato Talib of Brunei LNG, and Associate Professor Simon Tay of Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Thank you all very much indeed, and I look forward to seeing you at future ASEAN events. Back to Jenny.
Thank you.
Baroness Neville-Rolfe, thank you so very much to you and your esteemed panelists today. So as the Baroness says goodbye to us, we are actually getting in a little bit more traffic from the UK, as it's around 10:45 in the morning there. Meanwhile, in Brunei, I'll tell you what our time is. We're coming up to 5:45 into our final hour of our ASEAN Business and Investment Summit 2021. Just to give us a sense of what's happening, we have participants from 50 countries who have logged in today. Thank you so much. And they're still continuing to come in. We've had the chat box filled in all the way from 8 a.m. this morning. Some of these guests have been with us and chatting and engaging for the last, I calculated, 10 hours. So thank you all so much for your engagement and your enthusiasm.